Cotard's delusion. Imagine waking up one morning and becoming absolutely certain, not afraid, not confused, but certain that you are dead. Not dying, already dead. Your heart beats, your lungs breathe, but your mind insists with terrifying conviction that none of it is real. This is Cotard's delusion, and for those who experience it, being alive is the hallucination. First described by French neurologist Jules Cotard in 1880, the condition was originally called le délire de négation, the delirium of negation. Patients deny the existence of their own body, their organs, or their entire self. Some believe their blood has stopped flowing. Others insist their internal organs have rotted away or vanished entirely. In the most extreme cases, patients believe they do not exist at all, that they are nothing, a void occupying space that does not belong to them. The condition is most commonly associated with severe depression, brain lesions in the parietal cortex, and certain neurological injuries that disrupt the connection between sensory input and emotional processing. One of the most documented cases involved a woman known in medical literature as Patient W.I., who after a severe brain injury became convinced she was dead and had been taken to hell. She reported that she could smell her own flesh rotting. Brain scans revealed that her neural activity had dropped to levels normally seen only in patients under deep anesthesia. Her brain was, in a measurable sense, functioning as though she were not fully alive. Neurologists described it as the closest any living brain had come to mimicking death. Patients with Cotard's delusion frequently stop eating, bathing, or engaging with the world because they see no logical reason for a dead person to do any of these things. Some have attempted to prove their death by harming themselves. Treatment typically involves a combination of antidepressants, antipsychotics, and in severe cases, electroconvulsive therapy, which has shown remarkable effectiveness in restoring the patient's sense of being alive. Perhaps the most terrifying prison is not death itself. It is being alive while your own mind insists, with absolute certainty, that you are not. Capgras delusion. Your mother walks into the room. She looks exactly the same. Same face, same voice, same clothes, but something deep inside your brain screams that this is not your mother. It is an identical copy, an imposter wearing her skin. Capgras delusion does not distort what you see. It destroys what you feel about what you see. Named after French psychiatrist Joseph Capgras, who first described it in 1923, this delusion causes a person to believe that someone close to them, a spouse, a parent, a child, has been secretly replaced by a physically identical duplicate. The patient recognizes the face perfectly. They can identify every feature, but the emotional connection, the warm, instinctive feeling of familiarity that normally accompanies recognition, is completely absent. Neuroscientists have traced the condition to a disconnection between the fusiform face area, which handles visual facial recognition, and the amygdala, which attaches emotional significance to what we see. The eyes send the correct information. The heart receives none of it. In a landmark study, researchers monitored the galvanic skin response of Capgras patients when shown photographs of their loved ones. In healthy individuals, seeing a familiar face triggers a measurable spike in skin conductance, a subtle emotional reaction. In Capgras patients, the response was completely flat. Their bodies registered no emotional recognition whatsoever, even though their eyes correctly identified the face. The brain had severed the bridge between seeing and feeling. Some patients developed elaborate explanations. Their spouse was a government-planted double. Their child was a robot. Their parent was an alien replica. Capgras delusion can devastate families. Patients may become hostile or fearful toward the people they love most, accusing them of being frauds and demanding to know where the real person is. Treatment typically addresses the underlying cause, whether it is dementia, traumatic brain injury, or psychotic episodes. But the emotional damage inflicted on families who are told they are not real often lingers far beyond recovery. The face is the same, the voice is the same, but when the brain stops attaching love to recognition, the person standing in front of you becomes a stranger wearing a perfect mask. Alice in Wonderland syndrome. The room is the same size it was 5 seconds ago, but suddenly, your hands look enormous, swollen to the size of baseball gloves. The walls are closing in, or perhaps they are miles away. Your own body feels like it belongs to a giant or has shrunk to the size of an insect. Alice in Wonderland syndrome sounds like fiction. It is not. First named by British psychiatrist John Todd in 1955, Alice in Wonderland syndrome, or AIWS, is a neurological condition that distorts the brain's perception of size, distance, and body proportion. Patients experience what clinicians call metamorphopsia. Objects appear dramatically larger than they are, or impossibly small. Their own body parts seem to grow or shrink in real time. A hallway might stretch into infinity. A hand might balloon to absurd proportions. The condition does not affect the eyes themselves. Vision remains technically normal. The distortion occurs entirely in the brain's processing of visual information, specifically in the temporoparietal occipital junction, where spatial perception is constructed. AIWS is far more common than most people realize. It disproportionately affects children, with some studies estimating that up to 30% of adolescents have experienced at least one episode. Migraines are the most frequent trigger, followed by Epstein-Barr virus infections and epilepsy. Literary scholars have long speculated that Lewis Carroll himself suffered from severe migraines with AIWS symptoms, and that his experience directly inspired the size-changing scenes in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, published in 1865. For most patients, episodes are temporary and terrifying, but ultimately harmless. They typically last between a few minutes and half an hour. But for those with chronic AIWS, daily life becomes an exhausting negotiation with a brain that cannot accurately report the size of the world. Driving, walking through doorways, and even reaching for a glass of water become unpredictable challenges. Reality is not what your eyes see. It is what your brain decides to build from what your eyes report. And sometimes, the architect gets the blueprints catastrophically wrong. Foreign accent syndrome. She was born and raised in the English countryside. She had never left Britain, but after a minor stroke, she opened her mouth and spoke with a perfect Mandarin Chinese accent. Foreign accent syndrome does not give you a new language. It rewires the motor circuits of your speech so precisely that your own native tongue sounds as though it belongs to someone from the other side of the world. Foreign accent syndrome, or FAS, is an extraordinarily rare speech disorder with fewer than 100 documented cases in medical history. It typically results from damage to the brain's speech motor areas, particularly Broca's area and the adjacent motor cortex, usually caused by stroke, traumatic brain injury, or multiple sclerosis. The damage alters the precise coordination of tongue placement, lip movement, pitch patterns, and vowel length that define how an accent sounds. The patient is not actually speaking with a foreign accent. Their speech patterns have simply shifted in ways that listeners interpret as foreign. A slight change in vowel timing can make an American sound British. A shift in pitch modulation can make a German speaker sound Italian. The most famous case occurred in 1941, when a young Norwegian woman named Astrid was struck by shrapnel during a bombing raid. After recovering, she spoke with what everyone around her perceived as a strong German accent in Nazi-occupied Norway. She was ostracized by her community, refused service in shops, and treated as an enemy collaborator. Her accent was not chosen, not performed, and not controllable. Decades later, researchers confirmed her brain injury had altered her speech prosody so precisely that it mimicked Germanic speech patterns. For patients with FAS, the psychological toll often exceeds the neurological damage. They report feeling like strangers in their own bodies, unable to recognize their own voice. Friends and family struggle to reconcile the familiar person with the unfamiliar sound. There is currently no reliable cure. Speech therapy can help in some cases, but for many patients, the accent becomes permanent. Your voice is one of the most intimate parts of your identity, and foreign accent syndrome proves that even something that fundamental can be taken by a single misfiring cluster of neurons. Clinical lycanthropy. The legends of werewolves have haunted human culture for thousands of years. But what if some of those legends were not myths at all, but medical cases? Clinical lycanthropy is a documented psychiatric condition in which a person becomes utterly convinced that they are transforming into an animal. They do not merely believe it, they feel their bones shifting, their skin stretching, their teeth lengthening. Clinical lycanthropy is classified as a rare delusion of metamorphosis. Patients genuinely experience physical sensations of transformation, crawling skin, growing fur, elongating limbs, even though no physical change occurs. The condition has been documented across cultures and centuries. Medieval European records describe people who were tried and executed as werewolves, many of whom exhibited symptoms consistent with this diagnosis. Modern cases are typically associated with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, or organic brain conditions. Neuroimaging studies have found abnormal activity in the areas of the brain responsible for body image representation, particularly the somatosensory cortex and the posterior parietal cortex, the same regions that help you understand the shape and boundaries of your own body. A 2014 review published in the journal History of Psychiatry cataloged over 56 documented cases of clinical lycanthropy, spanning from the 17th century to the present day. The most common animal transformations reported were wolves and dogs, followed by cats, horses, birds, and frogs. One patient at McLean Hospital in Massachusetts reported feeling his spine curving, his jaw extending forward, and thick fur erupting from his forearms. He dropped to all fours and attempted to hunt in the hospital garden. No physical transformation had occurred. Clinical lycanthropy reveals something profound about the fragility of body identity. Our sense of being human, of having a specific shape, specific limbs, a specific form, is not fixed. It is a neurological construction, assembled in real time by the brain. When those circuits malfunction, the boundaries of the self can dissolve entirely, replaced by something the conscious mind interprets as becoming something else. The werewolf legends may have been wrong about the transformation, but they were right about one thing. The monster was always inside the mind, not the body. Alien hand syndrome. You reach for a cup of coffee with your right hand, and your left hand, without any conscious command from you, slaps the cup away. You button your shirt with one hand, and the other hand unbuttons it immediately after. Your own limb has become a stranger living inside your body, with its own agenda and its own will. Alien hand syndrome is not a horror film premise. It is a documented neurological reality. First described in 1908 by German neurologist Kurt Goldstein, alien hand syndrome occurs when one hand acts autonomously, performing complex, purposeful actions entirely outside the patient's conscious control or awareness. The condition most commonly results from damage to the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerve fibers connecting the brain's two hemispheres, or from lesions in the supplementary motor area. When the bridge between hemispheres is severed or damaged, one hemisphere can initiate motor actions that the other hemisphere, which houses the patient's conscious sense of agency, has no knowledge of and no ability to stop. Documented cases include a woman whose left hand repeatedly tried to strangle her while she slept. She was awakened multiple times by her own hand gripping her throat. Another patient reported that his alien hand would grab objects from shelves in stores without his knowledge. He would discover items in his pockets that he had no memory of taking. In one case, a patient's two hands entered into visible physical conflict. The right hand would open a drawer, and the left hand would immediately slam it shut, creating a loop of contradictory actions that the patient could only watch in helpless frustration. Patients describe the experience as profoundly disturbing, not because the hand moves, but because the movements are purposeful and intelligent. The alien hand does not flail randomly. It grabs, pushes, interferes, and acts with apparent intention. This raises unsettling questions about the nature of consciousness itself. If a limb can act with purpose outside of awareness, what does that reveal about how much of our behavior is truly under our control? We assume that we are the sole occupant of our own body. Alien hand syndrome is a reminder that the brain may house more than one will, and they do not always agree. Dissociative fugue. One morning, a school teacher in New York vanished without a trace. 6 months later, a man calling himself Bert was running a small pet shop in a town in Pennsylvania. He had no memory of being a teacher, no memory of his wife, no memory of his previous life. He was not hiding. He genuinely did not know who he was. Dissociative fugue does not erase your memories. It builds an entirely new person on top of them. Dissociative fugue, from the Latin fuga, meaning flight, is a rare dissociative disorder in which a person suddenly and unexpectedly travels away from their home, assumes a new identity, and has complete amnesia for their previous life. Unlike simple amnesia, where a person knows they have forgotten something, fugue patients are entirely unaware that anything is missing. They do not feel confused. They do not search for answers. They simply live live as someone new. The condition is typically triggered by overwhelming psychological trauma, combat, abuse, natural disasters that the mind cannot process. Instead of confronting the unbearable, the brain does something extraordinary. It creates an escape route by constructing an entirely new self. The most documented case in modern psychiatry is that of Ansel Bourne, a preacher from Rhode Island who in 1887 withdrew his savings, traveled to Pennsylvania, and opened a small shop under the name Albert John Brown. He lived as Brown for 2 months, with no awareness of his previous life. When he suddenly woke up one morning as Ansel Bourne, he had no memory of the preceding weeks. William James, the father of American psychology, personally studied this case, calling it one of the most remarkable examples of the mind's capacity to divide itself. Fugue episodes can last hours, weeks, or months. When the original identity returns, the person typically has no memory of what they did during the fugue state. They wake up in an unfamiliar place, sometimes with a new job, new relationships, and no understanding of how they got there. The condition reveals that identity itself is not as fixed as we assume. The brain can dismantle and rebuild a sense of self with terrifying efficiency. You assume that the person you are when you wake up tomorrow will be the same person who fell asleep tonight. Dissociative fugue proves that this assumption is a privilege, not a guarantee. Wendigo psychosis. In the frozen forests of northern Canada, indigenous Algonquian peoples spoke for centuries of a terrifying spirit called the Wendigo, a creature born from human greed that consumed people and was never satisfied. But the most disturbing part of this legend is that some people believed they were becoming the Wendigo, and their fear was so consuming that it drove them to the very acts they were terrified of committing. Wendigo psychosis is a culture-bound syndrome historically reported among Algonquian-speaking peoples of North America, including the Cree, Ojibwe, and Innu. The affected individual develops an overwhelming, paralyzing fear that they are transforming into a Wendigo, a cannibalistic supernatural entity associated with winter, starvation, and insatiable greed. The person experiences intense cravings that they interpret as a desire for human flesh, even when surrounded by adequate food. They may become deeply agitated, unable to eat normal food, and increasingly convinced that the transformation is inevitable. Anthropologists classify it as one of the most dramatic examples of a culture-bound syndrome, a mental illness whose symptoms are shaped entirely by the cultural framework in which it occurs. The most documented case is that of Swift Runner, a Cree trapper who during the harsh winter of 1878 killed and consumed his entire family near Fort Edmonton, despite being only 25 miles from an emergency food supply. He later told authorities that a Wendigo spirit had possessed him. Whether Swift Runner suffered from Wendigo psychosis or used it as justification remains debated. Anthropological records contain dozens of similar cases from the 17th through 19th centuries, where individuals requested to be killed by their communities before the transformation could complete. They genuinely preferred death to becoming the monster they believed they were turning into. Wendigo psychosis challenges the Western assumption that mental illness is universal in its expression. The content of the delusion, the specific fear, the specific monster, was entirely determined by cultural context. Modern psychiatry has debated whether it constitutes a genuine clinical category or a cultural interpretation of psychosis. Regardless of classification, it demonstrates that the mind does not just break, it breaks along the fault lines that culture has already drawn. Every culture creates its own monsters, and Wendigo psychosis proves that sometimes the most terrifying thing about a monster is not that it hunts you from outside, but that your own mind can convince you it is growing inside.